Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. It's my pleasure, as always, to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for this evening's program, East European Jews Between Renaissance and Futurelessness with Kenneth Moss. Before we get started, a few housekeeping things. Your video and audio will be off throughout the program. You may send us questions via the question panel at the lower right. We ask that you keep questions short and please refrain from comments so we can get to everyone's questions this evening. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's presenter, Kenneth B. Moss. Kenneth is the Harriet and Ehrlich E. Meyer Professor of Jewish History at the University of Chicago. He is the author of Jewish Renaissance in the Russian Revolution, which received the 2010 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, and An Unchosen People, the Jewish Political Reckoning in Interwar Poland. With Ben Nathans and Taro Surumi, he co-edited From Europe's East to the Middle East, and with Israel Bartal, he is the co-editor of Volume 7 of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, National Renaissance and International Horizons, 1880 to 1918. From 2014 to 2020, he co-edited Jewish Social Studies. Welcome, Ken. Delighted that you were able to join us for this evening's program.
I really do want to begin by thanking Lisa and Elizabeth. And I want to thank everyone for being here. I look forward to your questions. And Lisa, can everyone hear me and see me as one ought?
Absolutely perfect. Now I'm going to sit back and enjoy the show with the rest of the audience. Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay, great. The early life of Dr. Max Weinreich, seen here, might be seen as a very belated chapter of the Renaissance. And I realize I have to put on my reading glasses, which is a testament to age. Raised in a secular German-speaking Jewish family at the turn of the 20th century in Russian Imperial Courland, which is now Western Latvia, Weinreich attended university in St. Petersburg, the capital, of course, of modern Russian culture. Thus, by age 20, Weinreich was completely at home in not one, but two of the sort of era's metropolitan languages and cultures, both German and Russian culture. And this set him apart from the large majority of Eastern Europe's roughly 6 million Jews, who circa 1900, as I'm sure many of you know, were mostly still fluent solely in Yiddish, although that was beginning to change rapidly. Weinreich was poised to take the same next step taken by his more famous assimilated Jewish contemporaries like Osip Mandelstam, Julian Tuvim, or Joseph Roth, to step out of the Jewish world and become a co-creator of one of Europe's universal modern cultures. And indeed, Weinreich went on to take a PhD in philology and linguistics in German at Marburg University in 1922. But by the time Weinreich began to pursue his PhD, his path toward becoming an unhyphenated European had taken a sharp turn in a surprising direction. Sometime during his high school years, he fell unexpectedly in love with the mostly unloved Cinderella of the region's many languages, with Yiddish. In 1913, at age 19, Weinreich produced a Yiddish translation of part of the Epic of Gilgamesh and an extraordinary translation of Book 9 of the Iliad, which kept the original Greek dactylic hexameter. At the Zoi hom die Treuer gewacht, und a gewaltige Eme hat ihr Heere befallen, geworfen in Isaac and Yish. Like the Italian writers who turned from Latin to Italian 4 centuries earlier, like fellow students at St. Petersburg University, not only of Jewish background, but also of Ukrainian, Lithuanian, or Latvian background, Weinreich was discovering that a vernacular language, many of whose users viewed it with indifference, could actually be remade as a supple medium of the highest artistic attainment. Now, why Weinreich should have chosen to translate such archetypically non-Jewish classics into Yiddish as the Gilgamesh epic and the Iliad is a matter for a different lecture, which I'd be happy to offer. Here, I simply want to emphasize that in undertaking these translations, Weinreich was joining in a much larger endeavor by hundreds and eventually thousands of East European Jewish intellectuals who, shaped by the nationalist ideas remaking the region, had come to imagine their own Jewish community as a nation and had come to see its 2 native languages, Hebrew and Yiddish, as treasures in themselves that could also perhaps become the vehicles of a modern secular Jewish culture. This was to be, in their minds, a secular kultur in which Jews could recreate themselves as moderns, free to explore all of the possibilities of the modern condition, while yet remaining part of a distinct community. Now, some years ago, I wrote a book about this Hebraist and Yiddishist Renaissance idea and the many efforts to make it a reality, efforts that reached maturity in the first 3 decades, this is St. Petersburg University, first 3 decades of the 20th century. Today, I'm committed to focusing primarily on a much grimmer moment in Jewish history, the 1930s. And so I cannot, alas, spend much time on the content and contours of the Jewish Renaissance idea, in which Weinreich was only one of many creative and optimistic participants. What I would like to do, though, before turning to what again will be a grueling story of the 1930s, is to walk you through just a few images, al regelachas, auf ein Fuß, that will allow us some conception of what was achieved under the aegis of this cultural Renaissance ideal, which in the years immediately before, during, and after the First World War began to show some extraordinary achievements. And I want to note just 3 of those. First, in the course of a little more than 2 decades, Hebraist and Yiddishist cultural efforts moved from small-scale, often quite isolated endeavors to truly grand collective productions, ranging from beautifully produced omnibus cultural journals and anthologies like the Hebrew Hatkufa, issue 1 is seen here, which in hundreds of pages every issue featured a vast array of literary work, critical essays, and literary translations from the whole of world literature, or the Yiddishist Ufgam, which featured work by Kiev's leading Yiddishist modernists, alongside path-breaking essays on what it might mean to create Jewish symphonic music, modern Jewish art, and modern Jewish theater. And speaking of encounters amongst the various arts, this is a second feature of the Jewish cultural Renaissance that bears remarking. In that same 2 to 3 decade period, from about 1900 onward, the Hebrew and Yiddish literati, who were the key bearers of the idea of a new Jewish culture, managed to draw some of the most exciting visual artists of Jewish background to the idea of creating a truly independent and modern Jewish culture that would include all the arts. And here we can see the great constructivist Elisitsky as an illustrator for both Yiddish. Oh no, did I get cut off?
You're still there,
Oh,
Ken.
goodness. All right. I don't know why it's accusing me of having not been connected. I see. Okay. So we see here Elisitsky. Oh, I don't know why it refuses to do this for me, but we'll see what I can do on the other sort of interface. No, does that work on your end, Lisa?
All good.
All right. As an illustrator for both Hebrew and Yiddish texts. And we can also see here a detail from Chagall's famous, deservedly famous, extraordinary murals produced for the first avant-garde Yiddish theater troupe. Third, and most poignant to me, was the effort to make these new Hebrew and Yiddish cultures the primary cultural milieu of one's own children. The Jewish Renaissance idea sought more than mere artistic renaissance for the sake of art itself, although that was central to it. It was meant rather to recast Jewish individual and communal life by offering an alternative both to traditional Judaism and to assimilation. As the creators of the new Hebrew and Yiddish cultures became parents themselves, many of them sought to ensure that their own children would grow up with all the riches of the Jewish and world cultures transposed into a secular key, and vitally into their own Jewish languages. And here we can see, if this thing obeys me, 2 products of this vision. The emblem of a Hebrew children's book publisher, Achinoar, drawn by the later Russian and Soviet artist Natan Altman, and a translation of Hans Christian Andersen's children's stories, and here with a cover illustration by Lisitsky, into a delicate, beautiful Yiddish by the great Yiddish symbolist writer Dan Nister. At the heart of the Jewish Renaissance idea that drove all of this creativity and much more was a deep optimism, a conviction that East European Jews had it in their power to make a modern collective life of their own choosing. This optimistic sense of collective Jewish agency and the great creativity it unleashed are amongst the chief draws for many of the scholars who choose to study East European Jewish history, many of those who have the opportunity to speak to you through this wonderful series. And it's that same sense of possibility and optimism and creativity that certainly that drew me to this field, if I may speak personally. But historians can't always choose the histories they want to study. And now I turn, for the rest of the talk, from the possibility of Jewish Renaissance to another, much grimmer possibility that reshaped Jewish culture, thought, and politics in the 1930s, really beginning already in the 1920s, the possibility, or as many came to see it, the probability that Jews had little chance of finding any good future in Eastern Europe. Max Weinreich will continue for now to serve as our guide. Weinreich, it should be stressed, remained deeply devoted to his Yiddishist vision of Jewish cultural renaissance all his life. In the early 1920s, he used his PhD years in Germany to join in a rediscovery of a lost world of medieval Yiddish literature gathering dust in European libraries. Resettling in newly reestablished Poland in 1925, Weinreich helped turn Vilna into the proudest center of the new Yiddishist culture through the creation of the first Yiddish language scholarly institute, the YIVO, through his leadership of a Yiddishist youth organization called Bean, and through the cultivation of a next generation of Yiddish scholars and poets. At home, he, with his wife Regina, herself much more at home in Russian than in Yiddish, raised their sons in their adopted language and its young secular culture. But sometime in the late 1920s, Max Weinreich's optimism began to evaporate, and his creative energies took a much darker turn. From cultural cultivation to the woeful creativity of what we might call the social sciences of catastrophe. He became someone trying to figure out how much damage has been done to his society, how deep it goes, and what, if anything, might still be salvaged. Sometime around 1930, Weinreich turned much of his energy toward a self-retraining as a social psychologist of youth, studying with Charlotte Bühler in Vienna, Edward Sapir at Yale, and initiating a grand project to collect the autobiographies of Polish Jewish youth of every background and persuasion, a project that, beginning in 1932, would in fact yield nearly 600 autobiographies of 17 to 21-year-olds, most of which we miraculously still possess. And I hope everyone on this call both knows this and that you've had the chance to buy and read this amazing collection of just 15 of those autobiographies translated into English. Sources from Weinreich's private life show clearly that he did not take this turn out of intellectual enthusiasm, but out of a rising sense of dread that things were going terribly wrong in the world around Poland's 3 million Jews and amongst Polish Jews themselves. And what he thought he discovered in those autobiographies really did devastate him. The most characteristic feature of Polish Jewish youth culture that Weinreich could discern by 1932 was widespread despair about the future. Typical, in his view, were the declarations of one young respondent that his generation was, quote, a hopeless generation, and of a second that Polish Jewish youth felt itself to be, quote, a youth without a future, end quote. And Weinreich recognized further that this was not simply due to the Depression, which did indeed seize Poland very hard, but also a matter of darkening political horizons. Polish Jews were coming to believe that they could not reasonably expect a decent future in Poland, or indeed in Europe as a whole, because increasingly large parts of the larger society of Europe, though certainly not all of their fellow Poles by any means, were telling them that they were a grave national or continental problem, probably malign, and certainly an objective blockage to national well-being. The proud Yiddishist and diasporist in Weinreich pushed him to argue with these young people. The book he published on his findings used the tools of psychoanalytic theory to argue that their despair was immature, as was their widespread hunger to leave Poland, for British Palestine in particular, and I'll come back to this soon, but really for anywhere. But at the same time, Weinreich was actually very reluctantly coming to share their sense that grave dangers were unfolding around the Jews of Eastern Europe, that there was little reason to foresee an easy future for this middleman minority in an era of want, fear, and nationalism, and that the Jews, as 10% of Poland's citizenry, really did not have the power to avert these dangers and ensure a happy outcome, at least not for the large majority of the community. And in this context, Weinreich, as analyst, not as ideologue, began down the stony path of, as I put it before, the sociology of damage and disaster, wrestling with a growing sense that the East European Jewish self was being undermined by emerging forms of negative identity, born of stigmatization and felt powerlessness. He became an informed, if reluctant, participant in a comparative sociology of global stigmatized minorityhood. Pulled away from the comfortable tradition of imagining Jewish nationhood as parallel to that of other historical nations, he began to think about Polish Jewish subjectivity in relation to African American experiences of violent exclusion. comparing how a variety of historically disempowered peoples had successfully maintained a positive self-image by drawing compensations from their specific store of historical narratives, Weinreich suggested that what Polish Jewry was demonstrating in real time was how such narratives could lose their psychological effectiveness. In other words, Weinreich's growing sense that his hopes may have been for naught did more than plunge him into despair. They drove him painfully toward new kinds of inquiry and dimly new kinds of insight that what might happen to a community, about what might happen to a community when its youth's identity is redefined not by any of its own stories, but by the enmities of others and a sense of powerlessness and futurelessness. Weinreich's shift adumbrates one that I have taken up in my work, and it's one of the stories at the center of a book I published more recently, An Unchosen People. As I noted, many of those who are drawn to East European Jewish history, not only scholars, but I imagine many of the people on the call tonight, are drawn by a special fascination with the creative plenitude of East European Jews, and I definitely count myself in that company. But An Unchosen People proceeds from a different intuition. It starts from the recognition, which I spend the first part of the book demonstrating, that someone like Weinreich was far from alone in his growing recognition that the Polish community in Poland, the Jewish community in Poland and across Europe might be facing grave dangers about which it could do very little, and if not necessarily nothing. And that distinction between little and nothing will be important to part of our talk. The rest of the book proceeds from the further recognition that Weinreich was also far from alone in his efforts to gain some understanding of the new situation into which his community had been thrust, and to find some response to those changed circumstances. That in fact, many East European Jews of all backgrounds, ideologies, ages, and social positions were being pulled toward this same grim task. What the rest of the book is about, and the rest of the lecture is about, is the darker kind of creativity that this provoked, the creativity of thought, of culture making, and of political improvisation, all coming not from strong faith in one's capacity to shape the world and one's own life, but rather from a growing sense that your community is being made into an immiserated one, that it likely faces serious danger, that this demands a rethinking of old assumptions and new forms of open-minded inquiry, if you are to have any hope of finding a way through, though there is no guarantee of that, and that if there is any sort of response available, it may not be the one you had hoped for, and may indeed raise painful questions of sacrifice, triage, and even communal betrayal. One of the forms of new thought that interests me, which I'd like to discuss with you, is that represented by Weinreich's turn toward the comparative sociology of the pressure of exclusion and group enmity on minority communities. I want to touch on this further and in some sense introduce as well three other forms of thought that were shaped in this pressure cooker. The first of these was new Polish Jewish social thought about political extremism, nationalism, and the weakness of liberalism in times of fear, want, and extremism. While thinkers like Weinreich were driven by the crisis to look inward, to ask what was becoming of Jews, others looked outward to ask what was happening to the larger society, nationally in Poland and across Europe. Some Polish Jewish intellectuals turned to psychological theory to wrestle with whether political enmities like anti-Semitism might be determinants of culture rather than mere masks for interest. Let's begin with the Yiddishist teacher and pedagogical theorist Avram Golem, whom we see here in good-natured satirical portraits by the Yiddish student teachers that he trained. These portraits celebrate Golem's tireless activism and optimism. He was the leading translator, for instance, of science textbooks for Yiddish schools, among other things. And you can find some of those in the Book Center's digital collection. But by 1932, he too was deeply worried about the fate of East European Jewry. Quite unhappily, he embarked on a study of the psychology of hate and rage. By 1932, he found himself wrestling with a grim sense that modernity had greatly increased the human capacity to hate abstractions, abstractions like whole groups of people, that such hate was absorbed at a largely precognitive level, and that this was the case with anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. Piquantly, he compared the absorption of anti-Jewish hostility in the home and school in Europe with the ways that, quote, in America, dogs used to be trained to feel hatred toward Black people, end quote. As some analysts took this sort of psychological turn, others groped toward political anthropology. In that same year, 1932, a second analyst, Ludwig Oberländer, argued that the question of anti-Semitism in Poland and across Europe had to be theorized in relation to nationalism's larger phenomenology and sociology. What he called militant nationalism's drive to create unity and unanimity in the nation, end quote, compelled its proponents to attack the critical faculty itself and to seek mythologies that could produce pre-rational unities in the nation. In this context, right-wing nationalism's turn to anti-Semitism in Poland and across Europe was somewhat accidental, Oberländer argued, because presumptions of Jewish malignity were already commonsensical for many in the wake of Christianity, or in the context of Christianity's long work on the European imagination. Anti-Jewish mythology was a kind of lowest common denominator myth. But contingency was no consolation for Oberländer. He predicted that this nationalist cultural assault would succeed in attracting growing swaths of Polish society well before it collapsed under the weight of its own empty myths and promises. Finally, some Jewish analysts were carried toward new structural theories about what a changing relationship between state, nation, and democratization might mean for East European Jews. In 1928, a figure named Avram Rosen argued that it was no accident that all the new states in Eastern Europe were converging on an economic politics aimed at driving Jews out of the middle class, regardless of the attitudes of individual policymakers. More important than any subjective hostility toward Jews or not, on the part of this or that prime minister, was the interaction of economic underdevelopment with a shift toward populist understandings of the obligation of the state to society. In eras of economic desperation, democratization combined with the logic of nationhood, combined with new kinds of expectations by ordinary people of how their state was to serve them, would likely devolve into demands that the regime serve the real nation over some parasitic minority. Even non-anti-Semitic regimes like the Pilsudski regime in Poland could be made captive to publics growing ever more fearful and ever more nationalist. Let me turn now from the realm of social thought to the realm of cultural response to crisis. As figures like Weinreich wrestled with the despair they saw amongst young people, others, especially artistic creators, asked a practical follow-up. Were there ways to shore up the embattled Jewish psyche, even if one could not change the conditions pressing on it? Among the preoccupations visible in secular Jewish cultural thought by the mid-1930s was a deepening interest in what sorts of aesthetic experience, particularly, might help young people bear up in the face of prolonged woes. In 1934, readers of Lvov, or now Lviv, journal Przegłąb Społeczny could find the Yiddish and Polish poet Deborah Fogel investigating what kind of children's literature might help rescue the contemporary child's subjectivity from the alienating present. Fogel hailed works that in their imagistic richness could help instill in European children what she called, quote, the legend of pacifism, leading them to the conviction, as she put it, that they were more like, quote, distant Indians, Africans, or Arabs than unlike them. In that same year, a writer named Chaim Grade, and you see him here with the glasses second from their right, sort of round face, began to try to produce a poetry that would directly counter Jewish despair itself. In the early 1930s, Grade was the rising star and leading voice among a cadre of talented young Yiddish poets in Vilna, known collectively as the Young Vilna Group, and here you see them. Like so many Yiddish poets, Grade too wrote much poetry that searingly thematized his generation's sense of foreclosure, enclosure, and helplessness. The poem Grade chose to open his first book imagines the moon as a drowned girl helplessly dripping poison over the frozen yards of the city and over the sick, starving families of Vilna's back streets, while the poet lies petrified on his bed, mute like a moss-covered stone in a field. At the center of Grade's useful poetics, as scholar Justin Kami and scholar Avram Novoshern have demonstrated, was precisely a burning sense that Polish Jews, and especially youth, were suffering an inner psychic catastrophe, one of Grade's keywords, and that this inner catastrophe was the product of larger Weltkatastrophen, world catastrophes unfolding around Jews. Yet, also, as Cami was also amongst the first to recognize, Grada was also quite consciously driven to seek to fashion a poetry that might directly counter despair and instead lend his readers affirmation and resilience. He sought to find his way to a poetry that could function as a form of healing and, quote, active embrace of what the world has to offer. Poetically, Grada's most interesting poetic effort to counter his readers' despair turned on an audacious mythicization of natural evolution. In two poems that he chose to close his first poetic cycle, entitled Yo, meaning yes, right, a word of affirmation, the word of affirmation, some sort of affirmation has been achieved via the poet's imaginative placing of himself in the narrative of evolution, such that he can understand himself not as a fallen creature, but as the pinnacle of a development toward which nature has been working all along. Thus, in the second to last poem in the anthology, or the collection, the moon is now healthy, and in its pure light, the poet regards his own naked body, and in an act of double imagination writes, "My body is the dream of the gorilla which lived for years in the ancient wood. Smiling, I paint the idyll for myself when I was still a chimpanzee. Man is yet too animal to become a god, but with this poem, I climb from the eternal upwards." Moreover, Grada imagines nature in enchanted terms, perhaps in a Spinozistic key, as endowed with an innate love toward him and humanity as a whole. Evolution is this act of love. In the final poem, entitled Yo, yes, he affirms, quote, "A bridge of eons becomes a rainbow thrown from my window to the woods. The animals, my forefathers, with amazed eyes, sniff carefully my newfound form. They caress me with hot teeth and sharp jaws. For generations we struggled that you should come to be. The jungle now makes a pilgrimage to me, whilst I clamber higher to the shining stars. I know the stars are far eternal, but I, sick man by the blue window pane, will my uncourageous, unbelieving heart command, even with violence, believe." Thus, imaginative re-narration of the man as beloved by an enchanted nature, even if he is hated by the world, becomes the grounds to demand of the heart that it believe, gloib, and affirm, yo. For Grada, this revelation that he is not a fallen creature, but the attainment toward which all of nature has been working all along, was not meant to be some hermetic modernist myth, but to perform what he himself called healing on his contemporaries. Of course, this was no easy trick. Grada understood that poetry could not simply instill belief, but rather could only work on what he called the heart through repeated aesthetic experience. Grada registered in advance that the subject seeking to overcome despair had to will his or her heart to believe this manifestly fictional myth repeatedly as a kind of spiritual exercise. And though we cannot, of course, prove that Grada's poetry worked on readers in precisely this fashion, we do have sources that capture a sense of such an impact. Grada emerged as a poet within a tight-knit milieu of young Vilna Jews. He was writing not for anonymous readers, but for friends and peers he knew intimately and whose doubts and woes he shared. Strikingly, looking back at the distance of 50 years, one of those young people, a memoirist named Shmuley Mabelis, recalled the impact of Grada's poems of affirmation in his circles with special warmth and clarity. Now, I've presented the work of a figure like Grada as a kind of cultural action. It was one of many searches in this era for forms of imaginative experience that might help Polish Jews, especially youth, bear up psychologically under woes they could not change. In this sense, we might see Grada and Vogel both starting down a path of 20th century thought about imagination's powers, well captured by observations by the philosophers Cora Diamond and Martha Nussbaum, that a substantial part of human freedom turns on not the freedom simply to do what we wish, but on the, quote, capacity to transform one's situation by the exercise of creative imagination, to see things differently. But we also shouldn't miss the painful limit that Grada felt compelled to accept. Grada was a deeply political poet. The poems with which he first made his name in the same period were written in direct reaction to the world's catastrophes within a manifestly socialist worldview about the nature of injustice. But Grada resolutely refused to offer his Jewish readers any hope that Jews had it in their power to do anything about the catastrophes unfolding around them, except endure them. In Grade's poetry, affirmation of the world cannot change the world. At best, poetry can only help transform our relationship to experience. As he put it, yes, this means my destiny is my virtue. For figures like Grade or Vogel, shoring up Jewish subjectivity against what was coming might be the best one could do. At the same time, other Polish Jews who also saw the probability that bad things were coming began to wrestle with a different and painful question. Perhaps nothing much could be done to alter the fate of the whole community, but what if something substantial might be done to change the fate of a non-negligible minority thereof? I want to turn now from the search for psychological succor through culture to the fraught question that occupies the last chapters of my book, An Unchosen People. The question that consumed many Polish Jews, but only availed a relative few, the question of trying to get out of Europe. Here we need to pull the lens back for a minute and sketch some particulars about two intertwined matters: the conditions bearing on the possibility of emigration for Polish Jews, and the decisive shift in the possible role therein of a land that remains very much in the news today, the small land that was then, in the eyes of the European world, British Mandatory Palestine, a place Jews had traditionally understood as the Promised Land, a place that growing numbers of Palestinians, who made up the majority of that territory, were thinking of as their country by native right, and a place that, since the 1880s, growing numbers of modernized Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, had come to imagine as the best, or maybe the only site, in which to create a restored Jewish nation and country. To make a very long story short, by the 1930s, emigration to most destinations, and most importantly the US, was nearly impossible for most Polish Jews for both legal and economic reasons. British Palestine was, briefly but importantly, the strange exception. Between 1932 and 1936, an unexpected British reopening of Palestine to Jewish emigration rendered it the world's most open destination for Jewish immigrants. By that time, importantly, the Zionist undertaking in Palestine was a real going concern. Jews made up 20% of Palestine's population in 1932 and 30% by 1936, and were well along in the construction of their own distinct polity, society, and culture, generally referred to as the Yishuv. So Palestine, or the Jewish Yishuv within it, was coming to seem to many Jews in Europe at least a realistic prospect of attaining a different and better kind of life. Much of the last and longest part of my book takes up the transformation of Jewish political thought around Zionism, the Yishuv, and Palestine in this era. In particular, I investigate how wide swaths of Polish Jewry, who had never before taken much interest in the Zionist endeavor, and who were neither proponents nor opponents, or sometimes indeed had been opponents of it, began to investigate its claims and potential with new eyes. I don't have time to address this dimension of the work this evening, but I did want to bring it to your attention. Instead, I want to turn these last remarks to a particularly wrenching form of creativity and decision-making under duress that took shape within this framework. What we might call the politics of triage involved in choosing to cut one's ties with the community and trying to get out. Now, three further technical points must be understood here. First, the British mandatory regime designated several tens of thousands of places annually after 1932 for Jewish labor migrants to Palestine. That is, places for penniless migrants who could come if they could prove that they would be able to find employment. This was called the certificate system. And this brings us to a second important point. The number of certificates was set by the British authorities, but the distribution of those certificates was in the hands of Palestine's Zionist organization and its branches overseas. Third, and hanging over it all, the total number of certificates was some tens of thousands a year, but by any number of measures, that was far, far less than the expressed desire for entry into Palestine among Polish Jews, as well as amongst German Jews, Yemenite Jews, and many others. In other words, these fateful years opened up the possibility of exit to Palestine for many more Jews than previously, but only for a relatively small minority of the community when push came to shove. And to add a further wrinkle, a small minority of the community, but with a disproportionate openness to young people. This redefined the calculus of political rationality and raised painful questions about politics, community, and ethics. Let's explore this painful history briefly by focusing on an ordinary young man about whom we know only through happy accident, a figure from the small town of Bielsk. And here we see Bielsk in 1937. Here we see a street scene, perhaps a young Jewish man, a little bit older than the figure we'll be looking at, because it's set sometime during the First World War, hence the German on the postcard. And this is the Polish army marching into Bielsk in 1919. It was in the disputed borderlands where Polish and Soviet forces fought it out. Let's focus on a figure who was 20 in 1935, that is, he was coming of age in the early 30s, and who wrote under the pseudonym Benjamin Reich or Benjamin Rotberg. In 1934, Benjamin was one of several hundred Polish Jewish youth to submit an autobiography to the YIVO. He then read Max Weinreich's 1935 book about the autobiographies, entitled Der Weg zur Jugend, and uniquely, he sent Weinreich his own 40-page response to the book, which is another way in which his voice survived in Weinreich's personal archive. And in this 40-page response, as well as in the original autobiography, we find both fascinating insight into Jewish political thinking at the grassroots and the joining of a painful argument between the young man and the older sociologist. Benjamin himself was deeply sympathetic to diasporist cultural Renaissance and Yiddishist ideals, the same ideals Weinreich embraced. He rejected an Orthodox upbringing as stupid and rejected with equal force romantic versions of Zionism obsessed with the cultural transformation of diaspora Jews into agrarian Hebrews. He was a devotee of modern Yiddish culture and was personally attracted to the ideals of socialism and the idealism of his communist friends. But sometime in 1934, Benjamin nevertheless joined the Zionist youth movement Hechalutz. And here we see just two of many, many Hechalutz groups. I have to actually leave it on this. And this is quite a fascinating case. Many of these photos can be found, of course, in the Yizkor Bicher and elsewhere. Hechalutz, meaning the pioneer in Hebrew, an organization devoted to bringing youth from the diaspora to the land of Israel or Palestine, where they were to be remade as secular, socialist, lowercase c, communist, Hebraists, indeed also in many ways militants. Benjamin joined quite openly to try to get one of the coveted immigration certificates to Palestine that Hechalutz could dispense to a non-negligible percentage of its members. In his autobiography and his follow-up response to Weinreich, Benjamin elaborated his thinking in straightforward terms. Based on wide reading as well as direct experience, he could only see a bad outcome for Jews in Poland and in Europe as a whole. Anti-Jewish sentiment was spreading beyond the right-wing circles we all know to infect the peasants he encountered as a village tutor, and even Polish workers, though Jewish socialists, he wrote, were loath to admit it. He dismissed hopes that all this was a flash in the pan due to the Depression. Quote, "We Jews began to feel a specific national oppression even before the crisis," end quote. And right-wing victories across the border in Germany and Austria drove Benjamin to conclude that however much he and the rest of Polish Jewish youth would welcome a social revolution, the fact was that the world had now entered an indefinite fascist era, as he put it. In laying out the evolution of his political thinking, Benjamin also joined a debate with Weinreich about political choice and rationality, and ultimately about ethics. In his 1935 book, Weinreich had, for all his darkening sense of the Polish Jewish situation, denounced the choice of well over 100,000 Polish Jewish youth to do what Benjamin had done, namely join Hechalutz in the hopes of getting out. He mocked the choice of numerous young people to devote all efforts to seeking one of the scant emigration certificates. He mocked it as irrational. Quote, "Zionism calls to the Jewish youth, let he who can save himself." But the disproportion between wanting to and being able to leave the diaspora, that is the chance of getting a certificate, was so obvious, wrote Weinreich, that the mass turn to pioneer Zionism had to be deemed a form of psychological escapism. Now, underlying this argument was an unstated postulate, which Weinreich would not give up, that the energies these young people were wasting on self-preparation and self-transformation, that an exit that would likely never come for most of them, would be better spent serving the Polish Jewish community in place through economic or cultural shoring up. Benjamin took the force of their critique and responded by arguing that quite the contrary, this was in fact realism about what resources young Polish Jews actually had to seek a future. Benjamin and his contemporaries knew that only a relative few Chalutzim would get a certificate, tens of thousands at most, and indeed that's what happened. But, he reminded Weinreich, if one became a Chalutz and engaged in the work enjoined by the movement, learning Hebrew, joining a work farm, and here we can see a work farm, Hakshara, one put oneself in a line, however crowded, and gain some real chance to get to Palestine one otherwise could not have. Of course, to put oneself in that line by investing effort in Hachalutz was only rational if no better future could reasonably be expected in Poland. But that was precisely what the 20-year-old Benjamin had come to believe. The underlying logic of Weinreich's critique of Zionism was his communal commitment. Since Zionism could not possibly help Polish Jewry as a whole, mass turn to Zionism was irrational. In his response, Benjamin countered that turning to Zionism was not irrational for the individual, because Palestine offered a concrete chance of changing a substantial number of individuals' situations at a moment when, quote, no other medicines will be found, certainly not for the whole Jewish community, end quote. Benjamin framed his choice thus, quote, it's true that the exit is too narrow and can't meet the need of the millions of Jews. The land of Israel can, however, be a partial solution for the Yiddenfrage, the Jews' question, and meet the needs of hundreds of thousands, end quote. If Jewish action could help all, or if Jewish action could not help all or most Polish Jews avoid a grim future, the only meaningful question was what practical steps might help some, quote. In the meantime, let us use every means of salvation for thousands of Jews, especially given that the land of Israel can solve the Jewish question, at least in part. For the meantime, we don't have anything better than Zionism, end quote. Here, in this debate between a sociologist of felt futurelessness and a young person seeking a way out, we see finally the ethical questions that the Polish Jewish situation was forcing to the surface of communal life. Here was an adult consumed by a sense that the young were abandoning the community at the moment of its greatest need, and a young person driven by a sense that his only way to a better life involved abandoning his culture and most of his community. And this painful debate, and here I'll come to a close, was further complicated by a third position relating to the question of one's children's future. In 1934, the Yiddishist educator Gershon Orinsky wrote from the small town of Pruzhany, that now it was common for the parents he knew to urge their children to try for a Palestine certificate. Orinsky was not talking about Zionist families, but about his own socialist diasporist circles. Here were parents with no connection to Zionism urging their children to invest all their effort in trying for a new life in Palestine. Here was a form of triage thought taking shape at a fraught site between communality and particularity, and perhaps beyond them. I've tried tonight to offer a glimpse of several very different faces of the East European Jewish experience in that lost community's short 20th century. On the one hand, expansive and ennobling visions of self-remaking that, however over-optimistic, proved richly generative of much beauty, thought, and meaning. And on the other, a second, unwished-for kind of creativity that yielded thought about the fragility of liberal institutions, about the special kinds of exposure of minority communities in times of fear and rage, about kinds of social suffering imposed by a sense of futurelessness, about the uses and limits of imaginative culture encountering the suffering, and about the ethical questions of self-help and triage in the apparent absence of better options. I've devoted most of my attention to this unwished-for insight vouchsafed by the 1930s, but at least on the screen, I'll end on a more open-ended note, not with a cultural ending, with a beginning, one of the figures to kind of come out of this world and to begin to think his way toward an affirmative poetics even more powerful than Grade's, one that would, in some sense, become the central achievement of post-war Yiddish writing was, of course, Avram Sutzkever, very much shaped in the same period. And here we can see in translations done by myself, and really primarily Zach or Sholem Berger, who I hope you know, a great poet. You can see here some of Sutzkever's more hopeful vision of how indeed creative culture and above all poetry could yet shore up the Jewish self. So I'm excited about to hear your questions, and I thank you so much for your patience.
Fascinating, Ken. Thank you so much. I'll start with this question. What gave them the idea to despair about their future? Were there political talk of the Polish government? I think what they're trying to say was their political talk. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a part of the book that comes early, because of course that's a great question. I mean, I think it's the kind of question that in some sense is a permanent and knotty question for both Jewish and Polish history. And any possible answer one could give is to step on the third rail of, was interwar Poland a very anti-Semitic place, or on the contrary, a paradise for the Jews, or some complicated story in between. I try, to the best of my effort in the book, as all responsible historians do, to try and give a careful and measured answer. I think one thing that's clear is that there was more and more mainstream framing of Poland's Jews, who were 10% of the population and 40 to 50% of the urban population, 30 to 50%, depending where of the urban population, and a very large part of the faltering middle class. There was more and more talk of them as a real problem. The mainstream nationalist right got more and more overtly and violently and deeply anti-Semitic, to the point where it really, began to work on new ways to spread the message that Jews were the problem. The mainstream, the Polish left remained opposed to anti-Semitism. The mainstream government in power, the Senację government that was a sort of semi-authoritarian government, is sort of a sphinx in this regard. And there's a lot of debate about where it stood. But I think there can be no question, if you're sort of reasonably objective about this, that that robust suspicion of Jews and a sense that Jews formed a problem in Poland moved from fairly central parts of the political discourse since the turn of the century to ever more central parts of the political discourse in the period we're talking about. And so that's why someone like Benjamin Reich, speaking from experience, he's surprised by his encounters with anti-Semitism in his own town that he hadn't seen just a few years earlier. And I think he speaks for a lot of people. Now, last thing I'll say, because I don't want to go too long, where this would have gone is an unanswerable question, right? It was Nazi Germany that murdered all of Poland's Jews, and for the most part, right? It's not, that said, I don't think there's any reasonable grounds for saying that everything was sort of, just fine and dandy until the late 30s or something, much less until when the Germans got there. And I try and demonstrate that carefully, mostly based on the work of many other historians, because it's not my primary concern in the book, and I invite you to take a look there.
It is a really interesting question to ponder. Did Weinreich have a relationship with Mendel Ringelbaum? If so, can you discuss?
Yeah, he had a very close relationship with Emanuel Ringelblum. I mean, well, I don't know, very close, a close relationship. Ringelblum was very interested. First of all, I should say, I'm sure this audience more than others would know that there's an incredible book about Emanuel Ringelblum by the great historian Shmuel or Sam Kasov, we know is often a guest at the book center. And so all questions about Ringelblum and many other things should be addressed there. He also has a very interesting take and a very helpful take on the previous question. Ringelblum, looked up to Weinreich and shared precisely Weinreich's commitments. They were very close in their intense Yiddishism. Ringelblum's politics were more complicated. He was a part of the Politzian left, which is a very strange, sectarian, interesting place with lots of intellectuals and not many followers, and kind of fascinating scene. Weinreich was historically a Bundist, though they began to despair of anybody's politics by the 30s. And despair of whether they could do anything to help Jews. But they were very close. Their Yiddishism was bound them together. And Ringelblum, like Weinreich, was fascinated by the question of where forms of vitality were to be found and nurtured amongst Polish Jewish folks, and particularly young people. He played an important role, for instance, in something called the Landkenntnische, the Jewish Krajosnawstwo Society, a kind of Jewish tourism society that Sam also writes about, and I write about this a little bit in the book as well. So yes, they were close. Their particular relationship, it's a little complicated in the sense that Ringelblum was in Warsaw, Weinreich was in Vilna. Ringelblum wanted to be affiliated with YIVO and connected to YIVO, but I think he did so primarily through a Warsaw setting. Another historian who can introduce a lot more clarity into that kind of question, really speaks to this world of the connections of all the Yiddish scholars and Yiddishist figures in this period is, of course, Cecile Kuznets, who's also been active at the center. And her book on YIVO is another place that you'll find great answers to that question.
Could you comment on the impact, if any, of Bund, which most likely numerically was not that different from Zionist organizations?
Yeah, the numerical question is kind of tricky. The Bund is actually in a pretty bad situation in the early 30s. The period I'm talking about, it was losing members, although of course it was never a negligible. It was always something substantial. But in a town like Pruzhina, where Benjamin's living, he says, everyone's leaving the Bund for various kinds of Zionism or communism, and so it's more complicated in larger cities. But of course, the Bund was a significant force. It became a particularly significant force in Polish Jewish public political life in the late 30s, really after the Palestine option seemed actually to have been foreclosed, because in 1936 there's a outbreak of what Palestinian historiography refers to as the Great Revolt, right? First full-fledged open conflict between the Yishuv and organized Palestinian population, and the Bund it had a strong core of followers, and the people who write about the Bund will argue with each other in a helpful way, in a serious way, about to what degree its late 30s sort of efflorescence was because of a kind of core group of supporters that had been carefully building up, particularly in the unions, and to what degree it was really lots of Jews who really had no particular interest in the Bundist ideas about how exactly socialism and revolution would come about, but were looking for anybody who had any kind of message of at least hope or at least defiance. And the one thing the Bund could command that nobody else could in the late 30s was an ally on the Polish street, that is the socialist PPS, which itself was not as strong as it wished to be, but it was not negligible. So, it was an active force. In my research, what I find is that, particularly in the early 30s, there were people who were true believers in its message of kind of steadfastness until the revolution comes. And that helped them get through the day. There's a fascinating autobiography. One of the young people says, I march in Częstochowa, which is a really important center of Polish right-wing nationalism. And we had this march that brought together, Bundist and Polish socialist marchers. And one march, does more for me than reading 1,000 articles. And I feel reaffirmed in my hopes that there could be an alternative to some bad end of all this. I have to say, for my purposes in this book, this is not just true of the Bund. I was interested in this book in people who are not true believers. There are people whose ideas about how this was all going to work out did not change one jot and tittle from the 20s through the 30s through the end. The important dimension of Hasidic life was a lot of capacity for betochen, for faith that this is going to work out, and also in non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox life there was real sense that maybe this is just the birth pangs of the Messiah, which is not a good thing, but ends in a good thing, right? And the same is true of many of the kind of hardcore committed Marxists, who were at the center of the Bund. They really had some account of how the worse things got, the more we were on the cusp, and that's interesting enough for some questions. But the question I wanted to ask, which is forms of creativity spurred by a sense of narrowing possibilities and rising dangers. In a sense, they kind of wrote themselves out of my book, although I do have something to say about them. So you'll find them there. But as I admit very early, all sorts of true believers are missing from this book, not because they weren't there, but because I don't think they're the majority, actually. That's an important thing to add. I think a substantial majority of Polish Jews by the 1930s did not have a committed politics. They were not part of one of four. There's this idea, there were Zionists, Bundists, or sort of socialists, Chassidim or the Haredim, and assimilationists. And as Benjamin Reich and many other young people tell Weinreich, if that was ever true, it's not true anymore. The large majority of young people, for instance, are searchers. They don't know what they want. They're desperate, but they're not true believers. And Benjamin says, in fact, the true believers amongst us in my generation are far and away of any sort, including Zionists, by the way. Any group of sort of hardcore committed true believers are a minority. And not to hijack the question too far away from the Bund, but I also note, one of the things I show in the book, and it's also shown in the important Hebrew language work of a woman named Rona Yona, is that the influx of people to the Zionist organization's own data, the Chalutz organization's own data, everyone knew very well that the majority of people flowing into the Zionist organizations had never been connected to Zionism before, and were not flowing in because they'd fallen in love with the poetry of Chaim Menachem Levi Alec. They couldn't, they were coming because they wanted a certificate, they wanted to get out. Chalutz finds in 1934 that 60% of its members had no affiliation with any Zionist organization prior to that. They didn't come from the Hebrew schools. So this is in general a world where I think we overestimate how many true believers there were, and fail to see how much desperation and new thinking about bad likelihoods and what, if anything, do about them there was. And I think that was actually the silent majority by any standard. And that's one of the arguments I try and make in the book.
What happened to Weinreich and Benjamin?
Benjamin probably died. I don't think we know. The great young Polish scholar, Kamil Kijek, whose really important book on Polish Jewish youth, the most important book really on this period about youth itself, is hopefully coming out in English. It's out Polish and it's being translated in English. He also did working with Rona Yona a little bit with me, but really it was his project. He published in Polish translations into Polish of the two documents by Benjamin that I mentioned, because he also recognized him as a really fascinating figure. And I think that nobody knows, but there's no no reason to think he survived. I mean, some people who wrote those autobiographies did survive and have even been tracked down, but no reason to think he did. Weinreich, on the other hand, really got incredibly lucky. He was out of the country with one of his two sons for a lecture tour, I think in Western Europe, if I'm not mistaken, or a lecture, or a conference, I forget exactly what. And with the help probably of the Jewish Labor Committee, the organization sort of the American Jewish left that helped sort of Yiddish adjacent intellectuals get refuge in the U.S. He got refuge, and he got his other son and his wife Regina out. So they survived. Of course, extended family did not. He lost Keith Weiser, Colin Weiser, who's writing an important biography, a dual biography of Weinreich and Shlomo Birnbaum, another Yiddish linguist and philologist. I think he says that Weinreich lost a couple of brothers and sisters, but he himself got him.
I'll jump into the next, one of the many questions. I associate Weinreich with Yiddish language textbooks. I believe he was a professor at Columbia. Is this the same Weinreich?
No, that was the son. Weinreich had two sons, and one of them, Uriel Weinreich, was a great, really a central figure in modern linguistics and particularly sociolinguistics. And he died young of a disease, but prior to that, he was a professor at Columbia. And Uriel, I'm sure working with his father, who outlived him, alas, who produced the English to Yiddish and Yiddish to English sort of standard dictionary, the beginner's dictionary that you should all have, although you shouldn't stop there. You should also have the wonderful Gittel Shechtavat Vishvanat dictionary. I believe he authored College Yiddish, but it might have been the father. I forget. It might have been Max, actually. I have to think about that. I mean, I began my Yiddish studies with College Yiddish, but that was many years ago. And I forget if it was Uriel with Max or Max with Uriel.
Was migration to the Soviet Union an option for members of the Polish Jewish community?
It was not easy. There were at least two interesting efforts to do so. One on a small scale, but kind of fascinating. One on a slightly larger scale. There was an effort by about 100 or 150 Polish Jewish kids and young people in Vilna. Most of them people with communist commitments, some of whom had been connected to Weinreich and had sort of come to see him as, not offering anything, whereas the Soviet Union did, including a figure named Lezaran, who became a very committed communist Yiddishist in the 30s. Later, he survived the war in a Soviet prison camp, and I think had different views of a lot of things after the war. But at any rate, a group of Polish Jewish young people, including some connected to Weinreich's Bean organization, which was sort of taken over from the inside by Lezaran and other communists, did sneak across the border and spend a couple of years there. I forget, and I don't remember exactly if they came back. And there's at least one autobiography that talks about sneaking across the border. The other effort, the scale of which I don't think we know yet, it was not zero, but it probably wasn't all that many, there was certainly attraction to and fascination with the Birbejan idea. This short-lived and largely, fake, proclaimed effort to create a Jewish national territory in the Soviet Far East. I say it's fake because they actually, didn't prepare anything, and people froze during the winter and starved during the summer, didn't have a place to live when they got there. Anyway, there was some real interest in Birbejan in the larger Polish Jewish and general European Jewish world, some of which was communists, but I think to my mind, even more interesting, I mentioned this in the book, but I don't really have much more data on it. More interesting to me was that there were actually Polish Jews who, by the admissions of sort of onlookers and people who knew them, had zero communist interest, and indeed were the wrong class altogether. They were so desperate for a mix of economic and maybe political reasons that there was sort of ambient interest, especially in 1934, in can one get to Birbejan? And this figure I ended with, Gershon Urinsky, who notes that so many of the town's young people connected to the sort of Bundi sort of diasporist world were actually eager to go to Palestine. He notes further that that's not because they've all become Zionists, and said, when they hear that somebody's gotten to Argentina, they want to know about that. When they hear that somebody's gotten to Cuba, they want to know about that. And by the way, if you look at the Prujana records, indeed, he's not just making these names up. That you can see a couple of people got to these places from Prujana in this period, but many more to Palestine. And he says, when suddenly in the middle of 1934, there was all this sort of basically kind of pro-Soviet forces propagandized the idea of Birobidzhan. And he says, when the youth started saying, is Birobidzhan for real? Give me a visa and I'll go. I just need to get out, right? So you do see that element. But I think it was, I think first of all, there was already in the 30s plenty of ways in which people who could have been sympathetic Soviet Union could start to see what Stalinism actually was. And really the borders were not open. I mean, you couldn't just wander off there, and Poland and Soviet Union were locked very much in deep conflict.
I'm going to make this the last question, which sort of is segues from the previous one. In a recently uncovered family letter from a cousin written in 1936 from Kovel, Poland, he talks of an interrogation. Would this have been in regard to issuing an immigration certificate to Palestine?
I don't think so. I mean, I'd have to, please don't send it to me, but one would have to look at the original. And I think the question is, what is it really interrogation? If it's an interrogation, it's probably the police asking about communist activity, real or suspected. That's my guess. But you'd have to look at the original to figure out what he means. I mean, interrogation says sort of, being subjected to hostile questioning at the very least. That was certainly how the police treated communists or suspected communists.
Kenneth, this was a great talk. Thank you. You have a lot of appreciations coming in for this. Fascinating. Tell us the book again, please.
The book is called An Unchosen People, Jewish Political Reckoning on Interwar Poland. And it's out with Harvard Press. And I'd love to, I'd be delighted if you read it. And if you read it, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for your time and attention.
And I'm happy to recommend to our audience that they do read it. It's a great book. And a really good talk. I hope you'll be back. Thank you again.
If you do bring me back, I promise to talk about something less distressing.
Okay. All right. We'll bring you back for a happy talk.
Happy talk. Thanks so much.
Happy talk. Thanks again. I'd like to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, who always does the amazing work of producing this show from behind the scenes with all of the technical challenges attendant. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's 2023 Decade of Discovery, Yiddish Around the World, and it's part of an ongoing series of programs brought to you, as I like to say, live from the Yiddish Book Center. I hope that you'll join us next Thursday, May 11th at 7 p.m. for Modern Occultism in Yiddish Popular Culture with Samuel Glauber Zimra. You can learn about this program and register by visiting yiddishbookcenter.org/events. And before I let you go, I want to thank all of our members out there in the audience for your ongoing support, which makes all of this work possible. If you want to learn more about how you can support the organization and also become a member, please visit yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Until next week, when we see you again, stay well, stay happy, and thanks for joining us.